Good evening, everybody. Appreciate you joining us this evening for our election forum. This is sponsored by the University of South Carolina Department of Political Science. My name is Kirk Randazzo. I am chair of the department. And over the next few minutes, you are going to hear from three of our political science faculty talking about different aspects of this year's presidential election, as well as the congressional races and activity that happened concerning the Supreme Court with the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Before we get to those presentations, let me offer some thanks. This forum would not be possible without the co-sponsorship and the help of the University of South Carolina College of Arts and Sciences, and in particular, Kelsey Hagan and Brian Gentry. We appreciate all of their help. Let me also thank the South Carolina Humanities Council for providing some financial support and some promotional and marketing materials to help spread the word about this particular forum. As we start moving throughout the program, let me just offer some logistical items. One, you will hear from three individuals, as I indicated earlier, and we're going to have time at the end for questions to any of those three professors. And so I would ask for people in the audience to please type your questions in the Q&A window. I'm going to be monitoring that, and I will ask those questions to the specific panelists when it becomes time for that Q&A session to begin. Let me also say, for those of you in the audience, that if you see on the chat window, there is a link to a survey that we'd like to hear your feedback on this particular forum. And this is information that will go to the South Carolina Humanities Council. So we appreciate you taking some time to fill out those comments. So without further ado, let me please recognize and bring to the floor, so to speak, in our Zoom environment, our first panelist. This is Dr. Todd Shaw. He is an associate professor of political science, and he's going to offer comments to us about the presidential election and some of the greater implications of that race. Dr. Shaw, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Randazzo, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening. And I'm just going to offer some comments with regards to the presidential election, or what I'm calling sort of a snapshot of the presidential race. So what I want to do is offer comments in three areas. One, just give an overview of the state of the 2020 race and talk about electors and polls. Then I want to talk about sort of current voting, because as you know, millions of Americans have already voted. And so to give an opportunity to think about those numbers. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about money and models. Money makes the world go round, and so it does in politics. So to discuss that, but then also talk about a few sort of forecasting and prediction models, not in great detail, but just a little. And then think about a big question that is probably on the minds of many Americans: is 2020 another 2016? And offer my thoughts about that. So when it comes to the question about electors, as you know, it takes 270 of 538 electoral votes in order to elect someone to be president of the United States. And I'm showing you here this sort of winding path model of the 538 group, which I'm going to be citing their work throughout this presentation. And what 538 have done, Nate Silver and his polling and research firm have done, is they created a graphic where they give you all of the states and the District of Columbia, and they show the sort of minimum threshold necessary for 270. Now you will probably notice that it goes from blue to red, blue being those states that at least by their indicators are more strongly or are the strongest leaners in the Biden camp, to red, the strongest leaners within the Trump camp or toward President Trump. And then there are these states in between. And you see that right now, if you were to sort of take this graphic literally, that Biden, by way of what we'll call the blue wall plus, they are predicting that he will have the 270 plus needed. But let's unpack that a little bit as we go along. And let's unpack it from the standpoint of the Electoral College itself. So as you probably know, that of course the Electoral College or the electoral vote and outcome is what elects the president, even though the popular vote is the main determinant to do that. But we know that there's times which the popular vote and the Electoral College vote have not matched each other, that the person who won the most votes per se in a presidential election was not necessarily the individual confirmed by electoral votes. And that's happened about 5 times in US history. Most recently, of course, was the Bush v. Gore race of 2000, where Al Gore won by 500,000 votes, but he sort of won it in the wrong places, if I can kind of put that in unartfully. And George Bush became president after a contentious sort of Florida recount, and then a Supreme Court decision. And then most recently, as you know, with President Trump, when he and Hillary Clinton were running against each other in 2016, she won by about roughly 2% or almost 3 million more votes. But again, quote unquote, won those votes in the wrong places, according to the electoral count. And so the dynamics of the Electoral College currently, because it has changed over time, but currently tends to benefit the GOP due to a wider distribution of GOP-leaning voters. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm taking these graphics from the Guardian newspaper, and they give a really nice graphic that discusses how sort of a concentration of populations don't sort of meet the threshold of the necessary number of states and electors. So California has has almost 40 million people, and those 40 million people, as doled out according to those congressional districts and the 2 Senate seats, has 55 electoral votes. But if you take a compilation of many more smaller states, including states that we traditionally think of as red states or lean Republican, Iowa, Montana, Mississippi, South Dakota, you add all those states up, they have about 37 or 38 million in terms of population, but 96 electoral votes. So you can see how that math could work out in some ways. And currently, it kind of tends to benefit the GOP given the dispersion of the population. Now, let me answer a couple of questions which might be on your mind, which were, first of all, were the 2016 polls wrong? More accurately, I would say, however, it was really some state polls were wrong. First of all, many national polls were correct because Hillary Clinton did in fact win the popular vote, and many of these national polls indicated that that at least by a small margin she was going to be the victor. Then many A-rated poll organizations sort of surveyed the same battleground states, so they became a little bit of a herding aspect to the pollsters. And so did they poll the right battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which became the critical states in Trump's victory? Then there was a perfect storm. Sometimes there is a perfect storm of coincidences for a candidate, even if not leading in the popular vote, to win by way of the Electoral College. Particularly given that both of these candidates had pretty high or pretty negative favorability ratings. And then some polls did not sort of properly weight samples by education. So the question is, are pollsters, have they learned more this year? And we can get more into that in the Q&A. All right, so let me just sort of think about this from the national poll averages. So I'm going to pull again a lot from 538. So 538 and Real Clear Politics, they both do these averages of polls. So they take various polls. They may have a weighting formula themselves. Often they do. And then they sort of plot these polls and figure out what's the average sort of figure. And you'll notice from this sort of these blue and red lines, which you've probably seen elsewhere, that at least since March of 2020, and this is from the 538, that the blue line kind of indicates that Biden has been leading over Trump, and not just sort of leading, but often cracking the 50% or a majority threshold over Trump. And so is this sort of due in part to the issues that we're all confronting now, COVID, sort of the social unrest around around sort of race matters and the economy? Well, likewise, Real Clear Politics would indicate, and I like their graphic because they sort of demonstrate it even a little more. I'm not biased one toward the other, but I think there's some interesting things that their averages demonstrate. Same thing that they're doing sort of the same process as you just saw a moment ago. Again, the blue line at the top and the red line at the bottom indicating sort of maybe an 8-point spread between Biden and Trump. But you'll notice that in this period of July, when you had this sort of confluence between COVID, social protest, and the economy, that things sort of took a turn upwards for Biden and a bit downwards for Trump. Okay, so let's talk about the state polls. And so there are various pathways candidates can take in order to get to that 270 plus electoral threshold. However, some candidates in some races have multiple paths, and some candidates have a more narrow path. And in this case, Biden, because he's leading by some of these national polls, or many national polls, and by many of these battleground state polls, his path toward 270 is a wider path than might be true for President Trump. Having said that, there are some key indicators. Some states will look to on election night to see which direction they go, to see if one candidate versus the other are going to become result in being the victor. So for President Trump, it would be Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Those are some sort of key states that will give indications of his likelihood of being reelected. For Biden, it's what we might call, excuse me, it's WI. But for Biden, it's what we have often called the blue wall of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then we also sort of throw in Minnesota. And so if you kind of look at sort of the Florida, Biden is fairly competitive in Florida by at least this one average, about 2% up. In Georgia, which is typically has not been the case for several election cycles, but the Democrat Biden is competitive and probably in the range of a toss-up between he and Trump, given that narrow margin and margins of error. And even in Texas, Biden is not that far behind Trump, although there may be some recent polls that are indicating a widening gap with Trump pulling ahead. If we look at Michigan, Biden has a comfortable lead over Trump that's almost like the national average of about 8 or 9%. If we look at Pennsylvania, he has a smaller lead, but still a fairly comfortable lead, particularly when you look to see that these lines have been apart at least since the spring. And then likewise with Wisconsin, that Biden has a fairly comfortable lead, a little bit more so than Pennsylvania, but not quite at the level of Michigan. So who's supporting the candidates? What are the demographic groups? And I'm taking this graphic from the Pew Research Center. It's a little bit dated, but I wanted to kind of at least give a bit of an overview here. And so Trump, among Trump voters are men, sort of whites with no college degrees and those living within red states. With Biden, it would be women, minorities, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, younger voters, as is demonstrated by the age category here, whites with college degrees, Seniors seem to be somewhat split, by the way. A little bit split here, which is part of the challenge here for President Trump. And then those who live in blue states. All right. Let me sort of then kind of get into our current voting and mail-in or in-person voting. So in 2020 may be an election with record-setting turnout. At least 62 million people have already voted, which is about 45% of the total votes cast in 2016. I'm sure that's ticked up. So my figure was of yesterday, and I'm sure that's ticked up more today. And we may see more than 150 million voters vote. So that would be a record high turnout, given that we still are in a period of a pretty high turnout, or very high turnout in the early 21st century. This comes from the work of Michael McDonald at the University of Florida and his U.S. electoral project. Now, we should be careful to say that simply because by his accounting thus far of the states he can locate these voter registration records, even though Democrats are clearly outpacing Republicans, we shouldn't draw too many conclusions, and we can talk later about why we shouldn't draw those conclusions until, of course, we know the final outcome on election night. Then mail-in person voting here in South Carolina. And so here in South Carolina, we do not have sort of party affiliation data, but we know that there's been a high rates of return absentee ballots, about 165,000 as of yesterday's accounting, with the highest rate of return being among African-American voters in terms of return rate, although there's high rates among all groups. Richland County, right here, lags a bit, but is still very high in terms of the number of returned ballots, and around about sort of the 80 percentile. A word about money. The irony of this race is that there's some things that are typically an advantage for the Republican candidate that have flipped between the Republican and the Democratic candidate. As of now, Biden has raised about $1 billion since April. Trump has raised about $730 million. Biden has, according to the New York Times analysis, support from higher educated voters and voters who are more highly educated and higher income in terms of zip codes. And the Harris ticket seems to be the result of this, or seems to be the reason why this has come about. Two more points really quickly. I'm not going to say much about models. In fact, I'm going to come back to this portion, but I am going to say just a word in the sense that there are various forecast models out there that are making some predictions about what's true of what might be true. And if you want to kind of, as an audience, sort of raise a few more questions about these models, from the NORPATH model of the primary voter model to Nate Silver's 538 model, we can discuss them more. But these are two models with radically different outcomes. One says, the first model says there's a 91% likelihood that Trump will be elected. The other model says there's an 86% likelihood that Biden will win. Let me wrap it up. So is 2020 like 2016? No. That would be my answer. Why? Trump is the incumbent, but he's facing some important headwinds in this race, not the least of which is the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of economic decline and social unrest. But given the levels of protest that we've seen witness, but at the same time, incumbents do have advantages. And we call it the incumbency advantage in political science. Biden is not a Clinton. Biden is polling at a higher rate in terms of that cracking that 50% mark, which Clinton often didn't break the 50% mark at the state level or at the national level. And so he's put more states into play, including those battleground blue wall states. Higher turnout is certainly almost assured, given what I just showed you a moment ago. There are fewer undecideds, but to say that Trump only has a 13% likelihood of being reelected, according to the 538 model, is not to say that he has no chance at all. And in fact, it wouldn't be wise to count the president out, given the electoral college advantages. All righty. So I'll pump my brakes with that. And I'll say thank you. I'm gonna wish you a happy Halloween and hope that Halloween's the scariest thing that happens in the next 7 days.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Shaw. Definitely appreciate those comments. We are now going to turn things over to Dr. Robert Oldendick. He is a professor of political science, and he is going to talk to us about some of the key down ballot races that we should pay attention to, including right here in South Carolina. So with that, Dr. Oldendick, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Kirk. I'm going to be talking about the congressional elections, and I'm going to start off with the Senate. And let's just start off by setting the context for the Senate race. Currently, we know that there are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats. In the 2020 election, there are 35 Senate seats up. 23 of these seats are currently held by Republicans, 12 by Democrats. So the Republicans have a little bit more exposure here in terms of the number of incumbents up. And in order for Democrats to become the majority party, they would have to have a net gain of 4 seats. And notice that 4 there has an asterisk, because if we have a 50-50 tie, then the vice president would is the one that breaks the ties. So this presentation kind of assumes that the Republicans will hold on to the presidency. If that changes and Biden wins, then this number goes down 1 in the numbers throughout. But for presentation purposes, to keep it relatively simple, we'll go with the net gain of 4 seats for the Democrats. And one thing that we are pretty sure of in terms of this election is that there is a seat in the Senate that the Democrats are going to lose. Based on our current outlook, we're pretty confident that Tommy Tuberville in Alabama is going to pick up the seat that's currently held by Doug Jones. So that would mean the Democrats would need a gain of 5 seats that are currently held by Republicans in order to gain the majority. So where are those 5 seats? What are the most likely kind of toss-up seats that are currently held by Republicans that Democrats could possibly take? And I would say that those 5 seats are in Arizona, where Mark Kelly is challenging Martha McSally; Colorado, where John Hickenlooper is facing off against Cory Gardner; in Maine, where it's Sarah Gideon versus Susan Collins; Montana, where Steve Bullock is challenging Steve Daines; and in North Carolina, where Cal Cunningham is facing off against Tom Tillis. Now, given that these are toss-up races, it's possible that one party or the other could sweep all 5 of them, which kind of changes the composition of the Senate. But as we look at kind of the changing majority, kind of the question that we're looking at here, can the Democrats sweep all 5 and put them in the majority? And while it is a possibility, I don't think that that's the outcome that we're going to see. I think that what is most likely to happen, at least as we look at these races a week out from the election, is that Mark Kelly will win in Arizona, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, and Sarah Gideon will defeat Susan Collins in Maine, but that Steve Daines and Tom Tillis will hold on to their seats in Montana and North Carolina, which, if that's the outcome, that leaves the Republicans with a 51-49 majority advantage in the Senate. But you notice at the end there we have a but. And the but is intentional because since we are in South Carolina, probably questions are being raised and said, well, where is South Carolina? Isn't South Carolina a toss-up seat? And I wanted to leave South Carolina to talk about that a little bit more in depth, because what we see in South Carolina, these are results from the previous races. In 2002, Lindsey Graham, when he went up against Alex Sanders, won with a little over 55% of the vote. In 2008 and 2014, he won about 58% of the vote in both of those races. And then in 2020, we're still waiting until next week or maybe the week after that, or who knows when, till we can put those results in. But there is another important piece of information for context that we need to put in for these races. and that is fundraising. And these are the funds that were raised by the candidates, reported to the Federal Election Commission. This does not include money from PACs or super PACs or dark money that came into the races. And you can see back in 2002, even in his first race for the Senate, Lindsey Graham had about a 2-to-1 advantage over Alex Sanders in that race. In his previous 2 re-election bids, he was able to greatly outraise his Democratic opponents. But in 2020, we can see that Jamie Harrison has just raised a tremendous amount of money that, based on figures reported last week to the Federal Election Commission, he's got about $108 million, which is shattering all previous records, and he's still counting. I mean, by the time we get to the end of this race, Harrison will have set the bar for most money raised in a Senate race by, a pretty impressive factor. And because of this disparity in fundraising, because Senator Graham is now facing a race in which he has a challenger that is as well funded, if not better funded than he is, we believe that this race is relatively close, particularly compared to the previous races. But if we're talking about projections of how this is going to go, there's one factor that leads me to believe that we're going to next week put the check mark in Senator Graham's column rather than Jamie Harrison. And that factor is the presidential race, because we believe that in this state, in South Carolina, Donald Trump will win by 8 to 10 percentage points. So that, let's say it's a 55-45 or 54-46 split. That would mean that there would be, a fairly, about 5 to 10% of the voters that would then have to split their ticket and vote for Donald Trump for president, and then flip and vote for Jamie Harrison, the Democrat, for the Senate. And as we look, there's straight ticket voting in South Carolina. And as I've looked through the data and tried to come up with that type of result and look for these Trump Harrison voters, it's difficult for me to identify a large enough percentage of the voters to think that enough of them are going to flip from Trump to Jamie Harrison in the Senate race to make Harrison able to pull off that victory. Certainly, it's going to be closer than the presidential race. There may be some African-American voters that are going to vote for Trump and then vote for Harrison. There are probably some Republican voters that are dissatisfied with Senator Graham for various reasons, maybe even going back to the 2016 race when he ran against Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. But in looking at the data, I just have not been able to identify a large enough percentage of those voters to think that ultimately Harrison is going to be able to pull off that victory. Going to be much closer than the 3 previous races, maybe a percentage point or 2. But if we look at this as kind of another one of those toss-up races, I think that that it's going to stay in the Republican column. There's one other thing about the Senate races that we need to take into consideration, and that is the state of Georgia. It's unusual that a state has 2 Senate races, but that is the case in Georgia this year. There's the kind of special election for the seat now held by Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to the seat after Johnny Isakson resigned from the Senate. And so this is the latest polls. These are polling numbers that just came out today. We can see that both of these races are pretty close, that there's in the Purdue Ossoff race, there's a Libertarian candidate, Shane Hazel, that's going to take a certain percentage of the vote. Given the nature of the special election, there's a number of candidates in that race, a couple of strong Republican candidates there, Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler, that seem to be splitting up the Republican vote. So that I think, based on the perceived closeness of these 2 races as we look at them today, it's likely that at least one of these, the Loeffler seat, will go into a runoff election, because in Georgia, you need a majority to be elected. You have to have 50% plus 1. If no candidate gets that, reaches that threshold in the original election, then it goes into a runoff, and that runoff election is going to be held on January the 5th. So if we're pretty confident that at least one and quite possibly both of these races will go into a runoff election on January 5th, then if that's the case and our other projections are correct, then it'd be 49-49 going into these two races, and the balance of majority control of the Senate would rest in Georgia on January 5th. So we won't know the majority in the Senate until well into January. And if you're in South Carolina and you think you've been seeing a lot of ads for the Senate in the Harrison-Graham race, you can imagine what it'd be like if one or both of these races go into a runoff in January. So all these races put together, again, there are a number of toss-up races, but the likely outcome is that the split in the Senate is going to be very close to a 50-50 majority, and how that balance tips to the Democrats and the Republicans is going to really depend on the results in some of these very close races. Real quickly then, let me shift to the race for the House of Representatives. The context for this race, as you know, every 2 years, all 435 seats in the House are up for re-election. Currently, the Democrats hold a 236-199 advantage in the House. In order for the Republicans to regain the majority, they would need to have a net gain of 19 seats. So we can look at what happens in the last 7 presidential elections to kind of get an indication of what might happen. So in 1992, when Bill Clinton won, the Democrats lost nine seats, and then they picked up 3 in 96. When George Bush won, the Republicans lost 3 seats in the House in 2000, but they gained 4 in 2004. In 2008, we saw a 24-seat gain for the Democrats in Obama's first election, but then the Democrats lost 8, and the Republicans lost 6 seats in the House with Donald Trump's election in 2016. So in only one of the last 7 elections, and that was pretty much a dominant 2000 election for President Obama, have we seen a 19 seat flip. And better comparisons are for those elections in which incumbent president is running. So in 1996, for Bill Clinton's reelection, the Democrats gained 3 seats. When George Bush was running, the Republicans gained 4 seats. When Obama was running for reelection, we saw the Democrats lose 8 seats. So in presidential elections, the historical pattern, at least in recent years, when an incumbent president is running, we see very, very minor shifts in the number of seats that party wins in the House of Representatives. So we don't think that there's going to be this 19 vote shift in either direction. In addition, we know that in the 2020 election, that there are a number of incumbents that are not running for re-election. 26 of those people are Republicans, 9 of them are Democrats, there's 1 Libertarian. So there's more exposure here. There is more Republicans that are not incumbents that are running, more open seats that are currently held by Republicans. Given all these factors, the conclusion that we're going to reach is that Democrats are likely to retain majority control of the House of Representatives. Of the 3 elections, the presidency, the Senate, and the House, this is the one I'm most confident in. So with that, thank you, and we'll turn it back over to Kirk.
All right, appreciate that, Dr. Oldendick. Thank you for those insights. Our final panelist for the evening is Dr. Jessica Shainher. She is an assistant professor of political science, and she is going to share her insights about the Supreme Court and what the recent confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett might mean for the elections next week. So Dr. Shainher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Randazzo. Let me get my screen up here. So hi, everyone. I'm going to take the one institution we haven't talked about yet, which is the Supreme Court, and I'm going to talk about how it might impact the 2020 election in a couple of different ways. So let's start with a little bit of a refresher because there's been a lot happening at the Supreme Court in the last 6 weeks. So Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away on Friday, September 18th. She was 87 years old. She was a liberal icon. She died 46 days before the presidential election. And within hours of the announcement, the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, released a statement saying that President Trump's nominee would get a confirmation hearing and probably be confirmed before the election. This announcement set off a nomination fight because just 4 years earlier, McConnell had refused to consider President Barack Obama's nominee to replace Justice Antonin Scalia. So a week after Ginsburg's death, President Trump nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who was a federal judge on the Seventh Circuit, to replace Justice Ginsburg. So in the course of a little over a month, the Senate vetted her and they confirmed her last night, 52-48 on a pure party line vote. So now Justice Amy Coney Barrett took the constitutional oath of office last night. She received the judicial oath of office this morning from the Chief Justice and got her keys to the office this morning. So she is now up and running. So let's start with a very simple question, which is, what does this mean for the Supreme Court? And it means that the court has become more conservative and its median justice no longer has an interest in maintaining the legitimacy of the court. Well, what does that mean? So let's walk through this. Justice Ginsburg was the second most liberal justice on the Supreme Court. She is being replaced by a pretty established conservative that researchers believe will be about as conservative as her mentor, who is Justice Antonin Scalia. This means that the median, the fifth person on the court, will shift. So it is currently, or it was, Chief Justice John Roberts, who was nominated by President George W. Bush. And it's going to shift over to Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was nominated by President Trump 2 years ago. To be clear, the shift seems very small and perhaps even consequential, but it's not. The Supreme Court is unable to enforce its rulings, and it actually depends on the popularly elected branches to do that part of its job. The popularly elected branches will do it as long as the court looks legitimate. And the court's legitimacy is based on a lot of different factors, but it ultimately mostly comes down to people believing that the Supreme Court's rulings are fair and that they're made based on some set of systematic rules. That doesn't mean that they believe it's apolitical. They just believe that people are using some sort of set of rules. The justices are using a set of rules to get there. And basically, if the court makes too many decisions that look purely ideological, people begin to doubt that the court can be fair. So as the Chief Justice, John Roberts has an incentive to keep the court from looking unfair or political because it's his court. It's known as the Roberts Court. Brett Kavanaugh does not have the same incentive structure and will probably continue to vote with Justices Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, as well as his new colleague, Justice Barrett. So what this voting coalition does is it puts the court to the right of the popularly elected branches by quite a bit, particularly if the Democrats manage to take the Senate back. And it also puts several popular precedents at risk, including, as the Democrats talked about during the confirmation hearings, the Affordable Care Act rulings. Understanding this, several Democrats have brought up this mostly unheard of idea, which is adding more seats to the Supreme Court in response. So this so-called court packing has been massively unpopular when presidents have suggested it in the past. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to do this in the 1930s when the conservative court kept overturning New Deal legislation, and the public accused him of bringing politics to the court, and he took a pretty hard hit for it. And research by Lee Epstein, Jim Gibson, and Mike Nelson actually suggests that court packing is still massively unpopular. But it also suggests that Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike are possibly willing to modify the court by fixing the terms of service, by putting justices on a fixed time schedule where they can only serve for so long. Republicans have repeatedly tried to get Joe Biden to take a position on court packing over the last couple of weeks, and Biden's refused, though he did finally suggest that his response would be to create a bipartisan commission to examine judicial reforms and different reforms for the federal judiciary. So that's the court, but you're all here to see what happens with the election. So let's talk about that. And one thing that we can take away is that people really care about this seat and that they're voting at least partially based on it. So my colleagues and I recently ran a nationally representative sample that asked about 1,500 respondents how they felt about the opening and who they wanted to fill the seat. And according to our results, which are on the screen right here, 50% of Democrats, 53% of Republicans, and 37% of independents consider the Supreme Court appointments to be very important when deciding who to vote for. This is compared to only 10% of Democrats, 8% of Republicans, and 14% of independents who said it did not matter at all. And importantly, most respondents also believe that the seat should have remained open until the end of the election. 92% of Democrats, 66% of independents believe that the winner of the 2020 election should have picked the person for what is now Justice Barrett's seat. Unsurprisingly, 66% of Republicans believed that President Trump should have filled the seat. And people used their money to show their frustration over the sudden filling of this seat. So Act Blue, which is a fundraising site for Democrats, took in $91 million for Democratic candidates within 28 hours of Justice Ginsburg's death. To date, they've raised almost $500 million for Democratic candidates since Ginsburg's passing. And this money has helped several Democratic challengers pull even in the polls. So in our own state of South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham is really feeling the heat of some of the decisions he's made regarding the Barrett hearings. So he's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He scheduled and conducted these hearings despite promising not to do so this close to an election just 4 years ago. Clips of this promise have bounced around the internet for days, and they've helped drive up donations for his challenger, Jamie Harrison. So while Harrison was already creeping up on Graham before Ginsburg's death, this kind of fundraising bonanza has helped Harrison, and it's forced Graham into the position of asking for money every time he goes on TV. So this race is now in a dead heat. And Graham's not alone, because money continues to pour in for Democratic challengers in tight races because of this seat. So races in North Carolina, Iowa, and Georgia are all more competitive thanks to the outrage money that was raised after Ginsburg's death. For the presidential race on the whole, a report from Brookings actually suggests that Justice Ginsburg's death won't ultimately impact the presidential election. It might mobilize women in the suburbs who vote, but it's unclear if that will mobilize them for or against President Trump. So while Republicans had clearly hoped that moving on this nomination would shore up support, especially given how many people voted for Trump based on his promise to nominate conservative justices to the bench in 2016. But instead, what's actually happening is the decision to nominate someone to replace Justice Ginsburg this close to election has mostly motivated Democrats and independents to put money in the pockets of Senate challengers and perhaps consider voting based mostly on this opening at least down ticket. Will this ultimately matter on election day? I personally cannot wait to see, but I'm not going to make any predictions. So thank you very much, and I will turn this back over to Dr. Randazzo.
Try that again. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Schoenherr. Appreciate your comments and insights about the Supreme Court. So we now have an opportunity to ask questions for all three of our panelists. And again, if anybody in the audience has questions, if you would please type them into the Q&A window. I'm monitoring that right now, and I'll go ahead and read those questions to the various panelists. And as folks are typing those in, let me kind of get things started with some questions that came in via email. And for the first one goes to Dr. Shaw. If you could tell us a bit more about the model differences that you displayed. You had one Norputh's model in particular that was showing a Trump win by a sizable margin, and then Silver's model that was showing a Biden win by a comfortable margin. how is it that two models can have such vastly different predictions?
Thank you very much, Professor Randazzo, and thank you for the question. So the simple answer to that question is it all depends upon the assumptions of the model. It all depends upon what variables a model uses, or more directly, a modeler or researcher uses to make a set of predictions. So in the NORPATH model, it is a simple model that bases, it's called the primary model because it bases its predictions upon whether or not there was an effective primary challenge or a set of primary challenges that results in a certain level of party unity. And NORPATH sort of predicts this model can tell us, he has argued that he's been able to predict the last sort of 26 elections of the past 26 election cycles, including the current one, because of course there is strong party unity around President Trump. Another assumption is about the change of a party from one to the next. Has a party effectively already been in office in the White House for 8 years, or is it a re-election and incumbency election? And so NORPATH uses these two sort of broad predictors or important predictors among these challengers to determine, well, what is the strength of the incumbent versus the strength of the challenger? That's how he comes up with the conclusion that Trump has a high likelihood of winning. The Silvers model takes a wider gamut, and often I'll say that it is not quite as static as the NORPATH model. When I say static, meaning that NORPATH effectively sort of said as of this spring, 2020, this is what my predictions are, and I'm going to hold true to those predictions. Well, the Silvers model, the 538 model, is a dynamic model. And it's also a model based on simulations. So it takes a wider range, in fact, a much wider range of variables, what it calls sort of the fundamentals, polling data, which the NORPATH model does not include, sort of economic variables, and some error term, which both models have. And it continually updates itself. So each time sort of there are polls and slight changes in fundamentals, the model updates itself. And so they run literally sort of 40,000 simulations. You can go to the site for each, and comes up with a predictor. And in fact, you can go to their site and make some presumptions on the electoral map and literally see how the probabilities change based upon who wins what state. I'm not pushing either model. I will say, however, that a model is only as good as its predictions. And so Silver will say, in effect, both have some claims, but Silver will say, in effect, well, even though there were a lot of folk who said last time that we were wrong, we did in 2016 give President Trump a 30% likelihood of probability of winning over Hillary Clinton, though clearly she was the favorite. And so I hope that sort of answers that question as to why models can be radically different. And it also polls can be different in that respect, given their sampling frameworks.
Appreciate that answer. Thank you for the insight. Our next question goes to Dr. Oldendick. And the question says, what does the sheer volume of funds raised by both Harrison and Graham indicate about the current state of politics?
Well, I think that there's a number of dimensions to that answer. But first is the competition between the parties. We continually talk about polarization and how sordid the two parties are, that the Democrats are more consistent in their views and talk to each other. Republicans, on the other hand, are in their kind of own echo chamber and they're consistent in their views. And as we get this, we see it in Congress, and we also see it increasingly among the electorate, that and it's very close. I mean, we talk about a 50-50 nation in a lot of the research that Pew has done. And as this election particularly the Senate election here in South Carolina, has become, by all indications, a very close race. We know that that competition increases people's interest, increases their willingness to give money. And the fact that in the Senate, the balance of the majority in the Senate looks so close that people are just incentivized to give money, that they both sides really want to win this seat as well as the other toss-up seats, so that we'll see not just in South Carolina, but in these other toss-up races, a great deal of money that's being contributed. And we talked about the Supreme Court. That was mentioned that in those races, after it was decided, after the Barrett nomination, that a lot of money poured into Democrats in those states. So it just says how divided, how polarized we are as a country. And the cliche is, well, this is the most important election of your life. Well, the stakes really are very high at both the presidential level and control of the Senate in this race.
Thank you very much. Our next question is for Dr. Shaner. You showed data in your presentation about the unpopularity of potential court packing or court expansion. Why do you believe that this option is so unpopular to the public, since the Constitution says nothing about a specific set number of justices on the Supreme Court?
This is a great question. So the Constitution doesn't say how many justices there are. We've gone from 6 to 10 to back to 9. We've been at 9 since the mid to late 1800s. And part of it is that, at least the best example we have of court packing, which is FDR, it was incredibly political. FDR was doing it because his legislation was getting overturned at the Supreme Court. He wanted to overpower those conservative justices. But it's also that people don't like it when politicians make the court look political. So the adage is kind of, to know the court is to love the court. The more you learn about the court, the more you kind of respect the institution. And this is especially true with the 9 justices that are there right now. There's just very little way that people can see the utility of court packing without making it look like it's a political maneuver. Adding term limits, people are a little more open to, because it seems more normal to them. That is something that happens at the state level, makes a little more sense, maybe a little easier to swallow.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question to Dr. Shaw. In your opinion, what do you think will be the impact of potential rejected mail-in ballots, voter suppression, and voter intimidation?
An excellent question, of which I can only speculate on. So in some respects, we will see a feature of the Electoral College is that it provides a certain level of certainty, and I say certain level of certainty, or a certain threshold of certainty, because simply the battle for who becomes the eventual victor is according to the sort of that electoral count that adds itself up, which it's easier to contest ballots in the state of Florida or ballots in the state of Minnesota than it is to contest every election in every precinct across the country. Now, that's not to make an argument for or against the Electoral College, but there's a way in which it conveys, it sort of minimizes to some degree the scale of the conflict that it could occur in arguing for recount. Having said that, then, so it is quite possible that with levels of voter suppression, with the recent sort of court cases where some courts have sort of argued that no, there shouldn't be an exception for absentee voting, or you cannot use COVID and the pandemic as a legitimate reason for absentee voting, or no, you can't extend the deadline. So those cases are being waged on a state-by-state basis, as opposed to across the entire country. I am not going to argue that these things don't matter. They can matter. But let's say that we are fairly clear. Now, here's the big if. We are fairly clear because of record turnout of the outcome around November 3rd or shortly thereafter. That's a big if. But let's say we are fairly clear, just as a thought experiment. If we're fairly clear because we have some sense, let's say that by a small margin, Biden has won Florida, and that blocks off that electoral path for President Trump. Even if we've seen some level of intimidation, suppression, or et cetera in the city of Philadelphia around Pennsylvania, it may still, the Electoral College may still tell us, well, numerically speaking, given where Biden is now, he's at, and so we'd have to do the math. I haven't done the math exactly, but he's at 270 or 271 now. Even if the ballots are contested in Pennsylvania, that'll simply add to the total beyond 270. That's a very rosy picture. I think your question implies, yes, but this is going to be a contested election. And so it's going to be hard to say. Record turnout does suggest that we may have at least some clearer picture, but we don't know. Because I'm not going to argue that this record turnout absolutely benefits one candidate over the other. So that's my long answer of I don't know.
Okay, thank you. I think I don't know might become a mantra for a lot of us over the next week. We have another question for Dr. Oldendick. And given the prominence of Lindsey Graham, both in terms of his stature within the Republican Party and his status in the US Senate, what are the implications to South Carolina and our state politics if Jamie Harrison wins on November 3rd?
Well, the obvious implication is that the state is changing, at least demographically, and that there is hope for Democrats in the state. Because if you take the results of the 2018 election and what we know about the state and how we would characterize it, that point, the Republicans captured all the statewide offices in the congressional races, while Joe Cunningham won down in the 1st district and Representative Clyburn maintained his district. The rest of the House races were all kind of 55-45 splits. And we always often like to talk about this as a 55-45 state. Well, if a Democratic candidate can then come up against someone that's been elected already 3 times. And if you look at Senator Graham's fundraising total, they're not meager. He has a lot of resources. If Jamie Harrison is able to pull out that race, it shows that maybe, as we've seen in some other states, maybe in Texas and maybe in Georgia, where we start to see traditionally strong Republican states kind of moving a little bit, that this election may be an indication that South Carolina is starting to move and becoming closer to a 2-party state than the solid red state that we have characterized it as being for the past 20 years.
Okay, thank you for that. A question for Dr. Schoenherr. When you think about potential changes of size to the Supreme Court, the last time we saw a shift in those numbers was during the Civil War. And arguably that was the most successful court packing in terms of actually changing the number of justices. Given that, and maybe even in comparison to FDR's famous court packing threat in the 1930s, should people be worried if Democrats actually add seats to the Supreme Court? Is this sort of the proverbial canary in the coal mine that should cause all of us to stand up and take pause?
So we'll define court packing here as just adding seats because there's been a lot of conversation recently about how the decision by Senate Republicans to leave so many lower court seats open at the end of the Obama administration would also amount to court packing as well, but this is a broader conversation. So we'll talk just about adding seats. To be honest, I don't think the Democrats are actually going to add seats because it is so massively unpopular. It looks like if other reforms are more palatable, that might actually be where they go, because adding seats is also going to require the Democrats win the House and the Senate, and that they have pretty much a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate unless they vote to get rid of the filibuster, which is a much larger conversation for another day. So I don't know that you should be worried about the Democrats actually adding seats, particularly because we've been talking about Justice Ginsburg for so long and how old she was. There are a couple of Republicans who are also probably nearing retirement age soon, though Clarence Thomas has promised to stay on the court for 43 years. So he's getting closer all the time. But he said, I want to stay on the court as long as I have been tortured by Democrats, and that's my entire life, so it will be 43 years. I love that quote. Also, and in addition to, Chief Justice Roberts is going to do everything in his capacity to make the Supreme Court look as legitimate and apolitical as possible. You saw this happen after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings as well. He will try his best to make sure that there are narrow rulings, that for a while they can keep some hot button issues off the Supreme Court's docket, so that they're not ruling on big issues until everybody kind of calms down a little bit. So I would anticipate that you're going to see that again as well.
Okay, thank you. For Dr. Shaw, has the Electoral College always tended to favor Republicans, or has this tendency shifted with more recent demographic changes over the last several years?
Yes, in answer to that great question, no, it hasn't always benefited Democrats. And some of this has, as you're indicating, follows different demographic shifts, but it also is favoring sort of party realignment. So the very fact, to give you a very concrete example, yes, it is noteworthy or newsworthy that Joe Biden, he's unlikely to win Texas, given some fundamentals, but he is making Texas competitive in ways Texas has not been competitive for a Democratic candidate for several election cycles. But that says nothing when we go back several election cycles when Texas, when the parties weren't quite as clearly aligned as they are of racial and social conservatives, more toward the Republican Party, and racial and social conservative liberals in the Democratic Party. When there were Southern Dixiecrats and there were Southern ways in which someone like Lyndon Baines Johnson as president, as a Southern Democrat, could carry Texas. So in some ways, the Electoral College sort of follows those lines, not cleanly, as you can see sort of from that population distribution. But these demographic shifts do matter, where people move and where they locate in states and where they concentrate in these states. And then the degree to which these states lose and gain population. So because the Electoral College follows the lines of those 435 plus 100 Senate seats in the District of Columbia, well, we'll put the District of Columbia off to the side. But if for instance, in the next apportionment, say the state of Michigan loses a seat, but the state of South Carolina gains a seat, given the census reapportionment, that's just another clear example of how that shift from one area to the next can matter, and thus that matters from an Electoral College standpoint. So it's a great question. It hasn't always mattered in respect of there's always a disadvantage. In fact, it's probably, and I can hand this over to Professor Holdenick, or I can just mention, it's probably more of an advantage from the side of the Senate than it is in the Electoral College in terms of those entrenched lines.
Thank you for that. I actually have a different question for Dr. Oldendick, so I'll throw this to him right now. You mentioned during your presentation the phrase "the incumbency advantage," and can you talk a little bit about how that incumbency advantage applies to the House and to Senate candidates? Is it sort of an equal advantage for all members of Congress, or does this advantage apply to maybe one chamber more so than the other?
Well, the incumbency advantage is for both chambers. It's a little bit more of an advantage for the House than the Senate. Over the last 20 to 30 years, about 90% or more of Republican incumbents win re-election. It's a tick less, 85 to 88% of senators run for re-election, win. So, the incumbency advantage is great for both the House and the Senate, because you've got name recognition, you've got the ability to run more, to raise more money, you've got constituency service. All those things really make it very difficult to unseat an incumbent.
Thank you for that. All right, so we are getting close to our time. We've gone just over an hour, and we've got just a couple of questions left, and then we'll likely call it a night. So our next question is for Dr. Schoenherr. So during your presentation, you mentioned that changing the term for Supreme Court justices was the most popular option among the public. But in order to change from a life tenure on the Supreme Court to a fixed term, that would require an amendment to the Constitution, which we know not only has to receive supermajority votes in Congress, but also needs to be ratified by a supermajority of the states. Given how difficult it would be to pass a constitutional amendment, what is the likelihood that establishing a fixed term could actually become reality?
Great question. The answer is not very. So it's the least bad option, I think, is what people look at. You're exactly right. It takes a constitutional amendment, which requires an immense amount of support. People are really fired up about the court right now. I would imagine if they weren't so fired up about the court, those numbers are going to move a little bit, and they're not going to be quite so supportive. We know that term limits don't work out so well in state legislatures and cause some problems. So what the one hard and fast rule we have in political science is that term limits don't work. So I'm not really seeing it happen, but it is a really interesting thought experiment to think about what would happen if we had term limits on the court, so that if or presidents were constantly getting to nominate X number of justices every term.
All right, thank you for that. So our final question is actually sort of three individuals posed versions of the same question. So I'm going to kind of combine things and actually just toss this last question out to any of the panelists that are interested in responding. So we have a situation, we've seen the president talk a lot about not conceding the election, commenting extensively on potential voter fraud, especially when it comes to mail-in ballots. We've seen several individuals take advantage of mail-in ballots or early voting. So given all of this, is there a certain margin of victory for either candidate that would need to happen in order for the public to remain confident about the integrity of our election? And I assume when we say margin of victory, we're talking margin potentially on November 3rd with the actual day-in voting, not necessarily the counting of ballots at some point later.
Well, we need another hour now to answer this question. Because given what we know about the way different states have to count for the mail-in balloting, we're not going to have an answer next Tuesday night. Just all the indicators are that, we really believe that Republicans are more likely to vote on election day. Those votes are going to be counted. But if we're sitting here next Tuesday night at midnight and think we're going to know who the winner is, I'd be very, very surprised because of the quote unquote red mirage. I think that ultimately, once it's Thursday or whenever we get enough, that a electoral college vote of 300 or more really kind of makes it pretty solid. The higher that number, the better. But yeah, again, that's one of those things that as we've modeled these different things, as Todd has talked about these different simulations, that is not the outcome that is likely going to happen. I think the electoral college vote is going to be very close. We can, if we look at the 12 considered to be toss-up states, you can allocate them in a, I think, not unreasonable fashion that gets you to a 269 tie. Now, again, that's a minuscule chance of that happening, but it's not outrageous. And so then if we think of a key state, I was going to ask Todd a separate question, what he thought the key state was. I think it's North Carolina. I think that if Donald Trump was able to win North Carolina, that would get him over 270. If Biden is able to come in and take that state, then it goes in Biden's direction. But you can make a similar argument for Pennsylvania. I mean, there's just, there's these 12 real toss-up states out there that they're called toss-up states because a week out, they are within the margin of error. And so I think that the extent of the controversy, I don't know how much it's going to be, but I would anticipate that there is going to be some controversy about the results of this election.
Yeah, I would fully agree with Bob, and I'll just add this dimension that kind of connects to another question very quickly, which is we as political scientists, but we're not the only ones, are often thinking about, well, what does the electorate that shows up, what does the electorate look like? What's the composition in terms of young people, of women, of minorities, what percentage do they make up? I will just add on to this question about sort of the electoral versus the popular vote dynamics, to the question about voter suppression. So it's a hard question to answer, partly because there seems like there's going to be higher rates of turnout among young people, among minorities, et cetera. But we don't know if the electorate is going to mirror these dynamics, right? And so we don't know if that ultimately, again, I use the example of suppression of some votes or intimidation around Philadelphia and its suburbs will have an impact on the electoral count in Pennsylvania. Those are dynamics we don't know. But if it's a very diverse and high electorate, someone also asked that about the Biden, that would lean toward aspects of that Democratic coalition that might benefit Biden. But Bob is absolutely right. It's all a matter of when the votes are counted from an electoral standpoint to determine a concrete outcome Americans can have confidence in.
All right, thank you very much for those answers. We'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. To all of our audience members, thank you for joining us this evening. Again, in the chat window, there is a link to a survey. If you could take a couple of moments just to put your responses there, we would greatly appreciate that. And with that, on behalf of the Department of Political Science, the College of Arts and Sciences, and the South Carolina Humanities Council, my thanks to Dr. Shaw, Oldendick, and Shainher for their expertise and for their insights. And to all of us, hopefully, if you've learned nothing else from tonight, you've learned that your vote matters. And please, 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 if you have not already done so, please make sure to make arrangements and vote next Tuesday, November 3rd. To our panelists, thank you. To our audience members, thank you as well. I hope everyone has a very pleasant evening. Good night.